Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast, where we have real conversations about all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, and today I'm joined with my co-host, Elena, and we're going to talk about how to handle homeschool opposition. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. All right, so when we choose to homeschool, one of the challenges is that people decide it's a great time to voice their opinion, because they don't necessarily understand what you're doing. And so they're going to drill you with questions and they're going to make you doubt yourself a little bit. Some people can be absolutely downright oppositional in their standpoints about your decision to homeschool. So today we're going to cover that topic about handling opposition with your homeschool. And I think that in general, when we deal with opposition, there's kind of two main responses we have. The first is that we want to let their words just tear us apart on the inside. They're going to fill us with doubt and uncertainty and concern, and then they're going to undermine our decision to homeschool. And if you're new at homeschooling, that's one of the challenges that you often face, is just all that doubt challenging your decision that you've made to homeschool. And the second is that we want to fight. It's like, oh yeah, get over here. That kind of thing. We decide that we need to stand our ground and prove our point and be really strong and bullheaded about our decision to homeschool. So there's kind of those two reactions that I've seen from people, and maybe even within myself. But I think it's important for us to first start with the why. Why are people so against homeschooling? Or some people, not everybody, but why do some people really oppose homeschooling? Do you have any thoughts or experience with having people oppose your decision to homeschool?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, more at the beginning. I think as you homeschool and people see that it's working and they see your kids and see the results, then it's less likely that they have as many comments. I think that the main reasons that people seem to oppose homeschooling is a few reasons. I could sort of almost pigeonhole all the comments into these kind of categories. One is to do with social. They seem to think that the kids are going to end up unsocialized. I remember even one person saying when they first met me, but your kids seem normal and socialized. And I was like, okay, I don't really think they're normal, but socialized, sure. But anyway, people have this preconceived idea about how homeschooled kids are. And I don't know, nobody stands around and says oh, well, that kid's shy and that's because they're public schooled, versus you might have a shy kid that goes to public school and no one blames it on public schooling. So it's just funny. I think that's definitely one that people are confused about, is socialization. Another one is about your ability to teach. They'll say things like, oh, well, are you a teacher? That's kind of the whole idea, is that, well, you must not be able to do it if you're not a teacher. And they start asking questions about how you're able to do things, especially more as the kids get older, because, I mean, pretty much anybody could teach an alphabet and numbers and, preschool type things or early years type things. Another thing, I guess, is they're just confused about the whole thing in general, how it works and is that legal and those kinds of concerns. So those are pretty much the reasons why I've noticed people oppose it. But most of all, the first two, the socialization and the, well, how are you as just a regular parent going to teach them? So,
yeah, good points. So one thing that I do know is that in general, and even if you look at anything we do in our society, if you do something different than what people think has to happen, their reaction is fear. Right?
Yeah.
Different is scary. Obviously, homeschooling isn't the mainstream norm. So people who see others choosing to do something different than that are scared about that because they don't understand how it can be successful if it's not the same as what they expected. So that's one reason I think people oppose homeschooling. Also, they tend to have a preconceived idea of what education needs to look like. It needs to have a teacher. It needs to be in a classroom. It needs to be done in this particular order. They need to do it through this particular method in order to be, quote, successful, because that's right. What they think that it has to be. It's really hard to wrap your head around doing something in a completely different and foreign concept. So that's one of the reasons they oppose, is that they think that you should be doing it the way that they expect, because that's what they want to see. And I think you're right too, that about preconceived ideas about homeschooling, because they don't get homeschooling. Homeschooling is often presented in a way in the media, or it was at least pre-COVID. I think post-COVID, we've seen a bit of a shift in this, but a lot of times people only understood homeschooling from what they could see in the media. And a lot of times homeschooling isn't presented in a very positive way in media. If we see it in the
Right.
news, it's often a religious extremist group, or the parents have been really abusive, or the kids have failed, or on the other extreme, that the kids have been super keener kids who are in university by the time they're 13. So they only
Right.
have those ideas about what homeschooling is. So it's hard for them to fully grasp that you would want to do that in your family.
Yeah.
So that's why people tend to oppose that.
Yeah, I think
So,
anything you do different than the majority in parenting or in life in general kind of has the same effect. So, yeah, it's definitely to do with that too. Like it's just different, especially if they haven't even heard of it really at all.
yeah, I do think that it's a little bit different now that we've got COVID experience and
Yeah.
everybody's had an opportunity to be home with their kids. And I think they have a better appreciation for the choices that people make. And also, a lot of people had their opportunity to be like, oh, it's not really what I thought. A lot of the people who chose to homeschool during COVID and some who did it afterwards discovered that there's a whole world out here that supports and encourages homeschoolers. We're not just trying to wing it all on our own. All right. So, as homeschoolers, one of the things I think is really important for us when we're, no matter what we do, is to have that why choice of why we homeschool in the first place. Because if we can create a foundation for a purpose for our homeschool, it means that we're more likely to not succumb to the doubt and pressure of people who are trying to oppose us.
If we understand why we're doing it, then we're not going to be like, oh no, maybe they're right,
Mm.
I think, yeah, I think a big thing too is having other people around us who homeschool so that then like if you're part of a group and you know other people, or even just if you know people online, I mean, not as ideal, but it's better to in person, but then you know other people are doing it. I don't know, the doubts are they don't get you as much, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so I think having a clear, like, why I'm homeschooling, write it down, put it somewhere that you can reference it on those hard days or the days that you've listened to too much opposition and now you've got those doubts starting to fester in, and having a support system in place to help you whenever you're dealing with opposition, and to make sure that other people that understand what you're going through instead of just the negatives all the time. So those would be two really important pieces for you as a homeschooler. If you're dealing with opposition, make sure you have those foundational pieces in place before you try to tackle the challenge of how to handle the people who oppose you in your life.
Another thing that is helpful sometimes is like having certain resource books that can encourage you and answer some of those questions, especially if you don't have a lot of in-person support. I mean, online can be good, but over the years, like having some actual hard copy books as well that have been encouraging. And then also, if you can, again, not necessarily easy to find, maybe online it can be easier to find, but somebody who's further along in the journey, like if you're just starting and you have little kids, and somebody who's further along the journey that can kind of help you realize that like, look, like I did it and my kids are fine. I remember there was one family in particular that had already graduated some of their kids, and then some friends who had their kids had gone on to post-secondary or gone into careers and moved on with their lives and were fine despite the homeschooling, so that really
Mm.
helped.
Yeah, mentorship is really helpful. The other day, I took my kids out to a field trip and we went into one of the big cities. We actually went to Toronto, and we went with a group of homeschoolers, but it wasn't like a small little community group. It was just a general field trip group, and we all went together. And I was absolutely floored because there were like 100 and something families that showed up. And just seeing the sheer number of people that showed up to go to this field trip was super encouraging. And they were from all different ages and stages and from all over the place and different ethnicities. And it was super encouraging. And having that kind of understanding that there is a community out here and I'm not by myself can really help you when you're trying to
Yeah.
not feel discouraged. So make sure you connect with people. I really think that that's an important piece as well. All right. So when we end up having somebody who's doubting or opposing or fighting with us about our homeschool things or questioning us about our homeschool decision, there are kind of, I think, a couple of different groups that we can consider. The first is one that's like just curious about your homeschool decisions. They're not really fighting with you about your choice. They're just kind of, maybe they just want to know more. Maybe they're willing to have a true discussion about your decision and they're willing to learn from you. This is a great opportunity to kind of paint over that media painting or to be able to see the artwork underneath, if you want to be all like metaphorical here. I think this is a great time to use real examples from what you've experienced and what you know about other experiences. I do recommend not doing tongue in cheek in these responses because it can be really quick for, well, I have a lot of really cheeky responses on the inside, but I have to be really careful that I'm not countering what I'm actually trying to say by including conversation pieces that are just going to cause more challenge. So try to be, the word I like to use is professional in your responses, because you want to make sure that you actually are answering their questions instead of just being cheeky about it. So what are some common questions that you've seen from people?
Like you said, there's some people who are like really just curious and who aren't kind of the argumentative type. If you get the people that are more like, I don't know, I kind of call them like the lawyer type, where they like seem to have an argument for everything, then that can be like exhausting. But I try not to like engage with that. So as far as like the questions, like the socialization question, I usually just say, yeah, actually we have tons of ways to socialize. There's a homeschool group actually in this community, and did you know it has, this many families, and on a regular basis we get together with people at this and this, and we've done these field trips and we've done that. And then in our family we also have opportunities with neighborhood children, and we have opportunities with, we belong to a church with youth groups. The kids hang out and play with the kids on Sundays. We do family to family different things like, hey, do you want to go on a hike? Do you want to meet at the park? Things like that, with either people through, the neighborhood or community or church or whatever. They have opportunities to socialize with people at the library, just day-to-day things that happen, and they get to socialize with all sorts of ages while they're doing these things instead of just their peer group. And usually then people are like, oh, I had no idea there were so many opportunities. I had no idea that you could be part of a homeschool group. I had no idea there was that many other homeschoolers in the area. And then it's like the conversation just kind of ends because they got their question answered. They were worried that we literally were just like in our house all day, not interacting with anyone ever. Yeah, I honestly have seen it that sometimes there's too many opportunities to socialize. And
Yep.
so I know right now, like I'm part of two kind of little subgroups in my community. And some weeks when I have time, we go to both. And some weeks I just go to one of them because it can get to be too much with everything else.
And this is where it's hard not to be cheeky. But I'm like, do you remember being in school and you hear the teacher, you're not here to socialize? Because school is never really designed to be a social activity. It's designed to be an educational activity. So why do people automatically think that school is the place for optimal socialization? I know it's because the kids are put in a space together and they kind of have to be together and learn how to work together. But
Right.
socialization just teaches us about how to behave in our society and communities, culturally, emotionally, responsibly. It teaches us how to act in different situations. But as long as we're able to kind of give our kids chances to interact with other people, not just kids their own ages, but also with kids of different ages and adults and other kids and things like that, I think that kids will
Yeah.
be fine and can pick up the skills needed quite easily. There's a quote that I found by a lady named Mary Kay Clark, and she says, "Don't worry about socialization. Wherever people congregate, there's going to be interaction and socialization. Where is it written that it needs to be in schools?" So I think you're right about just answering we have lots of opportunities to socialize with a wide range of people. One of the best things is that we are able to allow our kids not only to connect with kids their own ages, but with people in all ages and walks of life.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And taking those opportunities, I think they just assume there aren't opportunities if you're not in
Mhm.
school. And
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there's especially on one income with homeschooling, often not everybody just has one income, but in homeschools, but many. And so it can get expensive to join all those extracurriculars that are available in communities, but there are free opportunities. I mean, there's neighbors, there's a library, there's all sorts of free stuff happening at our library, even in a smaller community. I know there's even a youth drop-in center. There's so many things that are out there, even just neighborhood kids going to the park. It doesn't have to be expensive.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think they just have this image in their mind of
Bubble
the
wrap kids in
kids
the
that
basement.
yeah, I don't know. It's weird. But yeah, I've had many times over the years people comment, but oh, but your kids seem so socialized. So it's weird.
The other really popular question is, what about university? It's kind of
Yeah,
like as if we've ruined our kids' chances for the future, that kind of idea,
that's
because
true. Yeah, I have had that too.
Yeah, so typically I think that people ask that question because they're concerned about our children's future successes, or
Yeah,
they also the idea that university is only the option that you can do after high school, or that there's only one way to get into university because it's hard to understand that there may be other options. And as
right.
homeschoolers, how can we kind of respond to that question with to people who are actually asking instead of just like
Yeah.
maybe.
So I had that question with somebody who's important to me. And so I just said, oh, there's actually many ways that homeschoolers can get into post-secondary. I didn't get into that, some people don't do post-secondary because it seems the world in general is very into that. And I think it's easier just to explain that people do. So yeah, so there's many different ways. There's many different options. It depends on what they want to do. And then I use real life examples. So I know actual families whose children have graduated homeschooling, gone on to post-secondary, gone on to different careers. So I'll say that, yeah, actually, I know a family whose children were all homeschooled, and one of them is a nurse, one of them is a paramedic, one of them is a pilot. They have successful careers, and they're like, oh, I had no idea.
Mhm.
So in general, if you can have a real life example, or maybe you don't know homeschoolers who've graduated their children, so maybe you've read something online and say, yeah, there's actually people that I'm aware of that have, a homeschooler that graduated that did this or did that. And just saying, like, some universities and colleges have specific ways to get in. It varies per school, but there's definitely ways, and homeschoolers get into colleges and universities. I mean, if they ask more specifics, you can get into the more nitty gritty specifics of how, I mean, it's complicated because it does vary per school. It's not one thing across Canada, but you can just give, a couple examples and be prepared for that. And then it seems to just people like, oh, I had no idea. Sometimes they also just fear that, like, how are you supposed to go back and teach things like, especially the sciences and the maths? I've always just answered like, yeah, well, there's ways to do that if I'm not equipped to do it. For example, I know people that have hired those out, or in our family, we've used some online things. There's ways to continue to homeschool at home, but use like distance learning. So, for example, in Ontario, there's the VLC or the ILC, and you're still homeschooling, but you're doing the online schooling that way, even just for certain courses. There's online private schools, like in Ontario, again, virtual high school, I think it's called. There's Christian virtual school. There's these different places that you could go and do like a certain subject. I know one year we did do a high school science course through Christian virtual school. I probably could teach it, but with everything else going on, didn't have the time. So she did it that way and got the materials. So there's just so many ways. And I think if we just say, oh, there's lots of ways to do that and lots of different things, and then just give a couple of examples, then it kind of people realize that, oh, it's not just what I'm thinking, that in their minds, you're homeschooling, your child will not be able to go to post-secondary, therefore they will not be successful. And that's not even necessarily true, but in their minds, that's what they're thinking of. Or they're thinking that you're going to limit your child's options. By homeschooling, they won't be able to do, post-secondary, therefore they'll only be able to do, a minimum wage job or whatever it is, instead of, having all the opportunities that kids who go to public school have.
Right. So some of the things I say is, well, if my kids decide to go to university, we're going to figure out a proactive plan and see what steps we need to get there. And we'll work together to make that happen. And if they decide not to go to university, I'm totally okay with that too.
Right. I personally don't open the can of worms of if they decide not to, because I find sometimes people just, I don't know, I've had experiences where then people jump on that and it just turns the whole conversation. So instead, I just tell them that no, homeschooling, there's many different ways to have all those opportunities, just like a child would in public school. It's just a different route to get there.
I think one of your points about outsourcing subjects we need help with, or that are like advanced level, or any of that stuff is really important. That kind of helps with the don't you have to be a teacher to teach kids question? Because
Right.
don't get me wrong, I love teachers. They are doing amazing work and they're of vital importance to the education system. But as homeschoolers, it's different. We don't need necessarily the same set of tools that a teacher has, and we have resources available for us. One of the
Right.
awesome things about homeschooling is I don't have to teach 26 to 30 kids.
Yeah.
I only have my 5. and I have to figure out each one, but we get to personalize the lessons. There's lots of resources that come in. So any of those questions that we have about are you trained to be a teacher? It's like, you're right. Trained teachers are really important for the classroom setting. So one of the best things is that I get to work one-on-one with my kids and I get to learn along with my child and amazing resources available to help me if I need to learn more.
Right. Yeah. The simple answers like that are best for starters. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are some of the examples that we can give you about just how to answer people who are willing to have a conversation. But then what about the people who are never going to listen? Do you have anybody that you've ever had to deal with that just no matter what you say, they're always going to oppose your decision to homeschool?
I really haven't had too much with that, other than one relative once, not a close relative, but was like, well, you just can't do that, and whatever. And I tried the typical, like what I just said, like giving examples. And it was the whole thing about post-secondary opportunities and all that. And
Yeah.
I don't know. I just said, well, we're going to have to agree to disagree. And then I changed the subject because honestly, some people you just can't get anywhere with. And I know that that person's personality is more argumentative and they have a narrow view on things that way. And so, I mean, you just kind of politely get yourself out of there, I guess.
Yeah, so there are some people who, no matter how much data, how much personal observation, or anecdotal evidence they get presented, it doesn't matter. They're always going to oppose your decision, and that's when we pull out my personal favorite secret tool, bean dip. Okay, when I was a new mom, I remember I was part of some groups and they had lots of conversations about how to handle opposition from people who didn't necessarily approve with your decisions of parenting choices. At the time, it was specifically about parenting choices, but I think homeschooling falls under that category again.
Yeah.
It's just a really powerful tool for any life decision that you bring up that makes arguments or negativity from other people. It gives you kind of a boundary and lets you be able to be in charge of deciding what's up for discussion and what isn't going to be a discussion at all. Just this is the only phrase you need to do. Please pass the bean dip. Now, it's not necessarily specifically bean dip. It's learning how to be able to change the conversation whenever you need to. It's
Yeah.
best when you don't want to defend or engage with a person over a specific choice. It's about being able to stop conversations because it's not really worth your time or energy. So he's sending boundaries. So this is what the lady who made this bean dip conversation, her name is Joanne Ketch, and she wrote about it. Unfortunately, the article doesn't seem to be online anymore, but she says, don't confuse setting boundaries with trying to convince someone of the rightness of your choices. It's a common and understandable desire to present the same information that led you to your decision. The problem is that dealing with a person who has boundary issues is that engaging with them invites discussion. And the boundary is that no one else has the inherent right to tell you how to parent or make your decisions. So
Yeah.
they said new moms often invite problems by citing authors and studies and sites to defend themselves. And every time you do, you create more discussion and rebuttal and send the message that your decisions are up for debate. So don't defend your choices beyond generalities and then only once or twice. So an example of this, if somebody is like fighting with you and is like, what about socialization? The short, curt answer, change the discussion. So we belong to a great homeschool community. Could you please pass the bean dip? Those kinds of things. But you're not a
Yeah.
teacher. Well, good thing I have access to so many resources. Can I get the bean dip, please? So it can just be an analogy for any way that you can change the conversation. I just think the bean dip concept is really funny and it's a really good visual. So
Yeah, just redirecting the conversation to something else is important. And for sure, like, I think it's an important skill. I know so many people struggle with boundaries, but I think it's a really, really important skill to just have those boundaries with people and not keep engaging people who really they're just out there to argue. And no matter what you tell them, even if you tell them, oh, I know somebody who, full did homeschooling their entire education and now they're like, won a I don't know, Nobel Prize or something. It's not going to matter to them. And you can pick out those people and know who they are. And I think most of the people, like I said, I really only encountered that once myself. most people are just they just have no idea how it works. And once you give them the information, then they're like, oh, and it's like they're suddenly enlightened and they just kind of drop their question because it's no longer a concern. One of the main things, and I noticed this with parenting too, like when I had my first, I would just, any mom that I saw, I would just like, bring up my concerns about this or that or another thing or whatever. And I remember the big, huge one was sleep. And
Mm.
always like, oh, how's your baby sleeping? Like, are they sleeping through the night yet? And whatever. And I just started answering things like, oh, they're sleeping like a baby. Like, because like sleeping like a baby, the expression means like sleeping really well. But what I meant was they're sleeping like they should be at this stage of baby. They get up to eat and cry and whatever. So I just kind of just gave an answer that, it wasn't a lie, but it was just, if I knew that the person wasn't really asking to care, but they were just, asking to then give me, 300 pieces of advice on what I should be doing, then I would just be like, oh, things are going fine. Thank you for asking. Like, because you almost got to just complain to or ask questions to people that are like on your side. So, the moms that I would see that were parenting the way that I would like to parent, then I'd ask them like, hey, like, what do you do when your baby's doing this? Or how do you handle this? And then I would get encouragement and help. I mean, I do have a good friend who has always chosen public schooling that I can be real with and talk about homeschooling, and she's always supportive. So they do exist. But in general, if the person's not supportive of your choices, or you can get that feeling that they're not going to be, then don't give them opportunity. Don't give them kind of like tidbits. Like if they say like, how are things going? Oh, things are going fine. Thank you for asking. Even if you're really struggling, but I guess you could say like, oh, thanks for asking. Yeah, there's some ups and downs, but we're managing, whatever, because it's just, it opens up a can of worms for people to give their input and their advice. And then you start doubting things. So reaching out to people who are kind of on your team when you have those kinds of things is definitely important. And that goes for all these kinds of things, because it just leads to people asking these things like, oh, like you're struggling with this, like what are you going to do when they get to high school? Or oh, like you're struggling with that with your student, like how are you making sure they're socialized? And it leads to these questions, I guess, is what I mean. It leads to people then having these concerns about how you're doing, versus if you talk to somebody who's on your side, then they'll be like, okay, like that's really challenging. This is how I'm dealing with it. And you don't get the judgment.
Right. And I think if the people that are opposing your homeschool choice are people who are particularly close to you and you're kind of worried about the conversations damaging your relationships and hurting people's feelings, that's where we're going to have to learn the skill of setting firm boundaries. And this is
Yes.
incredibly hard when they're family and people that you care about, because you don't want to hurt anybody, but you also don't want to end up having to like break that relationship completely. So another quote from Joanne is, with some people, you need to set firm boundaries. The offer of bean dip will not be sufficient to redirect them. In these cases, the redirect will need to be backed up with an action like hanging up or leaving the room or even the event or unfriending them
Yeah.
on Facebook. Remember, boundaries are not about forcing someone else to comply. It's about what you will or will not do. The idea is to shut the conversation down and to let them know that you're not willing to have a discussion about this anymore.
Yeah.
So, listen, I know that you love us and you love our children and you want the best for us, but this is the decision we've made for our family and it is not up for discussion. Now, can I tell you,
Yeah.
it's so hard to say those things when
Yeah.
like, for example, if it's a parent and you have to say it to a parent because you want to respect their opinions, but at some point you may have to say no, right? So it's like, I
Yeah.
know you don't understand our choice and that's okay, but I'm not going to have this conversation anymore. Let's talk about something else or I'm going to have to go.
Yeah. I haven't had to do that with homeschooling specifically, but I have had to do that in other areas of my life, be very firm with even family members and say, like, this is the way it is, whatever. And yeah, I can think of several times where there's been conversations with a family member that I have had to say, hey, either we need to stop talking about this or I'm going to have to go now. And like, it's on the phone. And then one time
Mhm.
they kept talking. So I said, okay, I love you. I'm going to go now. And then I just hung up the phone. And I think then
Mhm.
they got the point. And now it's not, as soon as I say like, oh, we're going to have to stop talking about this, then they change the subject. So it's just, I think you have to, it hurts, but you can do it in a loving way. Like you said, like, hey, I know you're really concerned about a family and I love that you love my kids. I love that you want to be helpful. However, this isn't something that's up for discussion. Thank you so much for your concern, but we're going to have to end this conversation now.
Mhm.
And then do what you have to do next if it's hanging up or walking away or whatever. And yeah, like it can totally be done in a loving way. It doesn't have to end in yelling or, name calling or whatever. It can be done very, very politely.
Putting the line there, like having the line, puts the onus on the other person to make the decision whether they want to value your relationship or
Yeah.
if they want to choose to argue and debate. Like they make that decision because you have set the line down about what you will be. 100%. It is so hard when it's somebody that you love and value, and trying to
Yeah.
figure out how to word it in a way that's respectful to them and still makes them feel heard and loved, but understand that you're not putting up with that
Yeah.
conversation because it's going to ruin your relationship, and that's not what you want. So I think that's an
No.
important thing to have. So
I think for
yeah.
me, I can think of the one situation in particular. I won't go into details. It wasn't to do with homeschooling, but something else, but involved my kids. And I actually like kind of rehearsed in my head what I was going to say ahead of time, because that
Mhm.
really helps to kind of make sure you're saying it politely. I mean, you could even write it down and do it that way. So I do think in-person conversations are better when possible. But if that's just like going to be impossible with that person, that's another way to do it. Yeah, it definitely is hard. And I mean, even just talking about it, I can feel my heart rate like getting
Yeah.
higher. I'm just like, oh, I hate these kinds of things. But it's really important if it's really necessary. And it really, in my experience, it's worked really well. So yeah.
Mhm. So set boundaries that you're comfortable with. Remember, it's up to you. You don't really owe anyone an explanation for your decision on homeschooling.
Yeah,
Be
that's a big
be
one.
respectful, and you're never going to be able to decide how other people react, but you can be in control of your response. So
Yeah.
just make sure that you know kind of where your line is,
Yeah,
and
and
then
you
be
can't
willing to
win
stand there.
everybody to the homeschooling is a valid, good choice camp. You just simply can't. There's going to be people that are holdouts. Some people over time might see the results and change their mind. I mean, even if they still also, put their kids in public school. Like I have a friend who honestly believes that both ways are great. And I mean, I honestly can see positives in both as well. And so but I really don't think that that's going to be the outcome for every single person. I think there's definitely going to be people who are just not going to see your side of things and who are, would argue you until you both collapse. And that's just not the type of people you want to engage.
All right, so I think the main keys to handling homeschool opposition are: one, understand why they don't agree. What are the reasons they might, so that you have a counter argument if needed. Having some solid responses that you can give, and adding a little more bean dip to your life. So homeschooling is a great choice, but not everyone's going to understand or appreciate that decision. So hopefully this conversation just helps you feel a little more confident in your choice and how to interact with those that don't agree, whether they're just not understanding or they want to understand more, or if they're super opposers who aren't ever going to change their mind. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. We hope that we gave you some tools that will help you handle any opposition that you face in your homeschool decision. In our next episode, I'll be sitting down and talking with Lindsay Castleman about social emotional learning, so I hope you'll join me then. If you have any feedback, ideas for topics, or people we should connect with for interviews, please let us know. And don't forget to share with your Canadian homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.